And welcome. I think we should start. I was just trying to figure out some technological issues. We are now live streaming the webinar on Facebook on the History Workshop's Facebook page. We'll also record the meeting and make a recording available later on via our YouTube channel. Welcome to this webinar on Red Lives, which is being hosted by the Wits History Workshop. This is the second of a series of webinars to mark the centenary of the South African Communist Party that's been organized by a collective that includes colleagues from South African History Online, UJ, Wits, Nelson Mandela University, the University of the Free State, and the University of Cape Town. The full program of events is available on South African History Online, and I've posted the link on in the chat. I hope you can see it. At the end of last year, we put out a public call for papers, and the program that you see is in many ways a reflection of the submissions that we received from this call. My name is Arianna Lissoni. I'm a researcher in the History Workshop, and I'll be chairing today's event. This follows on quite nicely from the first webinar that was hosted by Natasha Erlang at UJ last month on the early socialist history and history of the Communist Party. That we hosted. This was the first of the webinars and took place in July. The focus of quite a number of the papers at this webinar was on biography, and they argued for the importance of individual history and of local history to understand the way that the Communist Party worked on the ground, and the complex relationship between the individual and the collective. The papers that have been presented today reflect the ongoing popularity of auto and biographical writing in South African resistance history, and a variety of approaches and methodologies that have developed in this respect. The lives that they talk about cut across different generations, class, social and cultural backgrounds, and yet they are all connected by the same red thread that has united and continues to unite millions of people around the world. I just want to acknowledge the presence amongst the participants of representatives of the families of several of the individuals that are the topic of the papers on this webinar, and also of several of their close comrades and fellow communists. I'm going to introduce the whole panel, and after that, each of the speakers will have 15 minutes to present their papers. We've also invited Professor Teresa Barnes to act as discussant and provide initial comments on the papers to start off the discussion. And after that, we'll open it up to all participants, and I'll take a few rounds of questions and comments until we get to 5:30, which is the time we're supposed to end. Can I ask everyone that would like to contribute to the discussion when we get there to send me a private message so that I can keep track of the order in which people would like to intervene? It's quite difficult if you use the raise hand facility, so rather send me a private message if you want, or of course people can send direct messages and comments to the panel by using the chat function for everyone. So let me introduce today's 5 speakers. The first is Goolam Vahed, who is a professor in the Department of History at the University of KwaZulu-Natal. He's written and published widely on Indian politics in South Africa, as well as the role of sports and culture. His most recent works include a history of the present, a biography of Indian South Africans between 1994 and 2019, and Color, Class and Community, the Natal Indian Congress and the struggle to defeat apartheid between 1971 and 1994, which is forthcoming with Wits University Press. His paper is on Dawood Seedat, the communist who insisted that there was no middle road to freedom. Our second speaker is Alan Kirkcaldy, who is Associate Professor and Head of the History Department at the university currently known as Rhodes. His research interests include environmental justice, mission history, history of the South African Communist Party, and queer histories. And the paper he's presenting today draws on a biographical book that is forthcoming with Palgrave Macmillan on the lives of Ivan and Leslie Schönbrücker. It's titled Everyday Communists in the South African Liberation Struggle, the lives of the Ivan and Leslie Schönbrücker. Then we have Billy Kenniston, who's a scholar and writer whose work focuses on the role of white activists in fighting racialism. This includes an MA from the University of the Western Cape on Rick Turner, which was published as a book by Jacana, titled Choosing to be Free, the Life Story of Rick Turner, and a PhD from the University of Illinois titled Explosive Thinking, Apartheid, Repression and Resistance, 1969-1984. And the paper he's presenting today draws from his doctoral research on Marius and Jenny Schoon. Nkosinati Teledi has been the General Secretary of the Police and Prison Civil Rights Union since 2009 and a member of its structures since its inception in 1989. He's been in the Central Executive Committee of COSATU since 2005 and also served as its Deputy General Secretary from 2005 to 2009. He holds various postgraduate qualifications in human resources and public management, and is completing a PhD in history on Joe Slovo's political fought at the university currently known as Rhodes. His paper is titled Slovo's Role in the Congress Alliance and the Contribution to the Liberation Struggle of South Africa. Last but not least, we have Ronnie Kasrils, who doesn't need much of an introduction. He'll be known to everyone as a South African freedom fighter, former government minister, and a prolific writer, public speaker, and activist. His books include Armed and Dangerous, The Unlikely Secret Agent, A Simple Man, and Catching Tadpoles, all published by Jacana. He's currently busy working on a new book collecting the first-hand testimonies of internationalists from around the world who carried out secret work for the ANC and MK during the struggle against apartheid. It's provisionally titled The International Brigade, Secrets of the War That Liberated South Africa, and the book should be coming out with Jacana later this year for MK's 60th anniversary. He's presenting a paper titled Crossing Borders, Portrait of the Peripatetic Communist Jabulani Nobleman Umalo Nzala. And finally, our discussant, Prof. Terry Barnes, who's a professor of history and gender and women's studies and the director of the Center for African Studies at the University of Illinois. Prior to this, she worked and lived in South Africa and Zimbabwe for 25 years. She's written and published extensively on various aspects of Southern African history, including women and gender, education, political history, and biography. She worked with Gail Gerhardt and Tom Carris and others on the biographical profiles for the the Jacana edition of Volume 4 of From Protest to Challenge. And her most recent book is titled Uprooting University Apartheid in South Africa, From Liberalism to Decolonization. Thanks very much to all the speakers and our discussant for being here today. Without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Goolam.
Thank you for that.
Thanks.
Okay, so my paper is on Dawood Seedat, who was not, little known, but in today's times, but those who are activists in the 1950s, 40s, and 50s would know him quite well. And I think, it's still a work in progress. It's based on interviews that I did with his son Azad and daughter Zoni, and also managed to get some, documents from the special branch, which are at the archives in Pretoria. Now, one of the problems we have with that is that I'm not sure if any of you tried getting those documents, but it's quite a challenge, because when we got the ones on Monty Naika, for example, it took them a year to provide the documentation, because they would mark out the name of every single name that was not Monty Naika. They would mark that out. But we did manage to get some information. But when I was doing a biography of Chota Mothala, I found that they just wouldn't give us any of the special branch reports that they had. So I'm not sure what the experience of others has been with that. So when I wrote the biography of Chota Mothala, I mentioned the value of a biographical study, because it can speak to a broader history. And in that case, I was able to tell the story of Peter Marisburg and the Congress and anti-apartheid politics more generally in that sitting. So with Dawood Seedat, one can look at activism from the 1930s to the early 1960s. The story is still incomplete, but I do think that we have the makings of a good story here. So Seedat arrived in Durban in the late 1920s, and this was the time when the Indian community was undergoing great change, as the indentured workers were making their way out of the cane fields and seeking a life in the city. And many, found work, a precarious existence as market gardeners and hawkers, and others would become wage laborers in the 1930s as the Industrial Revolution made its late entrance in the city. Now, Seedat originally, came to Durban partially to study, but I think his real education, according to his son Azad, was when he was around 15 years old, and there was an anti-pass rally that he attended in 1930, and he witnessed 4 people being killed, and one of them was Johannes Nkosi. And it is stated by Phyllis Naidu that many years later, at least 20 years later, he and his wife organized a ceremony, at the gravesite in Ambilo, where they invited Nkosi's family. So this incident left a mark on him, and it shaped much of his activism. So to understand Seedat as a communist and as a political activist, I think one has to situate him in the global and local forces that were shaping the period. Globally, on the one hand, you had fascism on the rise in places like Germany and Italy. But on the other hand, the Soviet Union also remained a beacon of hope for local communists. And between these poles, Seedat sought to build a revolutionary ideology. Now, the Indians who had arrived in Natal had come in 2 streams. One was the indentured workers, and the other was the so-called passenger Indians, who came on their own volition. Now, Seedat himself, his father was what you can call one of the passenger Indians, and their family was based in Ladysmith, where his grandfather had a store in Murchison Street. It is said that his younger brother, Ismail, had polio, and so when Dawood was a young boy, he was sent to Durban to be brought up by his maternal relatives. And but soon after, his parents followed him to Durban, and because his father wanted to provide a suitable education for them. Those of you who know the history would know that the only school at the time for Indians, the only high school was Sastry College, built in 1927. So no matter which part of the country you were in, you had to make your way to Durban to get an education. So that seemed to have done well for the family, because one of his brothers became a cardiologist and another was a maxillofacial surgeon, and both lectured at the medical school in Natal. So Durban in the 1930s was a city in transition. It's, I'm not going to go into all of it because we don't have time, but the poverty of the period is well chronicled. And we know that, Poonen and H.A. Naidu were amongst those who were instrumental in organizing a Communist Party branch in Durban. But around 1937, then, that they had stayed aloof from politics, but it was only around 1937 that they got involved in a non-European unity front. Prior to that, in the 1920s, when similar attempts were made, the moderate faction of Indian politics refused to get involved in, with any non-Indians, because India had placed an agent general in South Africa to oversee the position of Indians, and they were told very clearly that if they got involved with Africans and coloreds, then that agent general would not intervene on their behalf. But this began to change with the emergence of a new group of leaders, and most of them would be well-known names like Billy Nair, Billy Peters, and I have already mentioned H.A. Naidu and George Poonen. So Seedat qualified as a bookkeeper, and he was also quite involved then in that period in trade union organization. But he was involved in a number of, this is quite a sort of, the young activists were very restive, and they were getting involved in lots of different organizations. There was a liberal study group, an India League, the National Protest Day Committee, a Stalin Memorial Committee. So there were all of these organizations that they had formed. And they themselves also got involved in the Natal Indian Congress, but they formed a separate faction within that called the Natal Indian Association, and they tried to unseat the old moderate leadership. Now, Seedat made his name during the Second World War. He came to national prominence because he and Yusuf Dadoo in Johannesburg were the two who actively spoke out against the war, and for that, he was imprisoned with hard labor. And maybe, I was reminded when reading this of some of the Jacob Zuma tactics, because each time he went to court, he asked for an adjournment because he had to secure counsel, and then he got someone from the Transvaal who had not been admitted to the Natal bar. So despite the protest from the prosecutor, he received a second adjournment, and eventually Harry Bloom defended him. But he made a very passionate speech against any involvement in the war, but he was sentenced to 3 months with hard labor. And when he was released, there was a massive public meeting in his honor to welcome him back. And Rusty Bernstein would write that the arrest of Dadoo and Seedat triggered the biggest campaign of meetings, handbills, and posters that the party had managed for years. Whether we affected the fate of Dadoo and Seedat, it's hard to say. Both were found guilty and sentenced to short terms of imprisonment, making them the first martyrs of the Communist Party revival. And it was also in this time that Indira Gandhi visited Durban, and that gave a boost to all of these young members, young communists, trade union organizers. And eventually in 1945, they were able to unseat the old guard of the NIC. But Seedat was also involved against the local Indian businessmen who were involved in black marketeering of essential goods like rice, and they held a lot of public meetings condemning the price of food at that time. Now, Seedat married Fatima Ali, and she was her sister was Rahima Musa. So both the sisters were very active, and they came from a very a family in the Cape, where they had mixed with people like Ray Alexander and Jack Simons. And Sissy Gould was also an influence on them. So she herself was very politically conscientized. And Ahmed Katrada said that whenever he came to Durban, his first stop would always be their home. Now, Fatima Seedat in her own right was a public speaker. She was even imprisoned during the 1952 Defiance campaign. She has a whole list of organizations to which she belonged. And when Dawood Seedat was banned, she too was banned in the 1960s. So some of the other features of Seedat's life that stand out is where he visited Eastern Europe and China in 1950, and he addressed meetings there. And when he returned, we have photographs. I've included one in the paper of him speaking in China, but he was probably the first South African to visit and speak there. He even spoke in East Germany, where he addressed the Third World Festival of Youth. So he said he brought back many of the Chinese revolutionary songs with him, and he addressed rallies locally. So Seedat, during the 1950s was very active, and so therefore it was not surprisingly, he was one of the treason trialists. He was also banned imprisoned during the state of emergency in 1960. I have 2 minutes. In 1960, and thereafter he was banned. So he and his wife had a big, quite a large family. So these years, the next part of the paper, I discussed the hardships that these years of banning had for them, because they were in a very tiny flat, and yet you find that they always try to buck the security branch. And Azad recalled during this period that his father would take him, they would go by bus to meet people like someone he only remembers as Uncle Om and Swaminathan, and I'm just quoting him, a Ganga guy in Sipingo, Hadi Diodat in Reservoir Hills, Debbie Singh, and a few others. And he also recalls his father taking him to the Frelimo rally at Curry's Fountain in 1974. So the 1960s basically were a very tough time for the family, because they had to support. The mother and father were not able to work, and they had a family of 8 children. And according to Azad, even though they were extremely bright family and all of the cousins became professionals, his father, and this is to quote him, did not want them to get any education. He says, "My father encouraged everyone to study. All his nephews and nieces, my cousins, are highly qualified professionals. Yet he never encouraged his own kids to study. In fact, he encouraged us to find work as soon as we finished school. He said that he wanted us to be working class, as you have a less stressful and better quality of life if you are a working class and you are able to put yourself before others." Right. So Azad, so in the post-apartheid period, and in the last part of the paper, I look at the fact that you have a Rahima Musa, a hospital in Johannesburg, and once at our own university in Durban, they had a Rahima Musa annual lecture on Women's Day. And when I suggested, I asked, why can't it be Fatima Seedat? I mean, nobody had heard of her, even though she was just as active as her sister. So who is acknowledged and who is not is down to politics. So the family has been struggling for almost 25 years now to get a road named after him, but that has been to little avail. And yet, as Azad mused, that the Northern Drive in Phoenix is actually named after A.G. Champion, and who was allegedly anti-Indian in the 1950s. That's how he is remembered. So in my last part, in my last paragraph, I conclude by saying that Dawood Seedat was a communist both of text and of the streets. His body bore the marks of his courage. Maybe there is some vindication that there is no road named after him. After all, he saw the national democratic struggle as a pause in the long-term struggle for a socialist South Africa. If he could speak, he would probably urge his comrades to get a move on to the next destination. At the same time, he would harangue the present incumbents of the party that they have turned a pause into a full stop. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Goolam, and thanks for keeping to the time. Let me remove spotlight, and it's over to Alan. Let me.
Oops.
Over to you, Alan. You have 15 minutes.
Right, sorry, will you just read my title? Because I forgot to write it on top of the paper. Oops, don't worry, let me start. Yes, yeah.
Sorry.
Okay, I'm going to stick quite closely to, sorry.
I didn't realize I was muted, sorry. But go ahead.
I'm going to stick quite closely to my written text because I'm very concerned about the time. So I'd like to, just before I start as well, acknowledge that Joel is here and also Rebecca Schoenbrucker. So there was another Schoenbrucker that I hadn't noticed in the beginning, and Luli Kalinikos is also mentioned in the text. So having matriculated in 1976 and coming from the ideological background that I do, for many years I viewed biography as bourgeois subjectivism. This is a term I appropriated from Walter Rodney, who I'm pleased to see that Rodney has cited in his paper. Underlying economic forces were what was important, and kind of everything else, I'm afraid I was rather crass in those days, was superstructure and shouldn't really be worried about. But especially from the 1980s, with the focus on history from below, wider social trends and micro-histories of individuals came to be explored. In recent years, this has been extended to communist parties overseas. This process has been an interesting one, and I'd like to add or argue is a valuable one. I currently have a book in publication which explores themes in the history of the South African liberation struggle through the lives of Ivan and Leslie Schoenbrucker, two everyday communists. People who were not publicly acknowledged icons of the party, but who played an important role behind the scenes. The activities of the party were built on the efforts of individual people such as these. Writing the book reminded me of the extent to which the role of women has been glossed over in South African historiography in general, and also in the history of the liberation struggle. There have been limited exceptions in the studies of iconic individuals, but most of these works are autobiographical or very short. The contributions of many women have been forgotten. So in this paper, I've pulled Leslie out of the book, which was about her and Ivan. Ivan will be mentioned because they had a very close personal and political partnership, but I'm going to focus on Leslie particularly. In the case of Leslie, the fact that she's been forgotten about has been partly due to her character. Unlike Ivan, she was not larger than life. She was also content to assume a background role and to support her partner and comrade Ivan. This served to hide the more clandestine parts of her activities on behalf of the party. However, it also clearly arose from the fact that she was a woman, and thus, for a number of her comrades at least, could not be as important as her husband. Leslie was born in Eshowe in then Zululand on 4th January 1926. Her father was a trader who later became a sugar farmer. What's interesting for me is that while they were financially better resourced than many of their black neighbors, the family were poor in comparison with many of their white contemporaries. See, her brother and her sisters grew up speaking isiZulu and in much closer contact with black people than many of their contemporaries, white contemporaries in the party at the time. This does not necessarily result in radicalization. Her brother and sisters lived conventional white bourgeois lives. She seems to have been more socially aware than them, even as a young person, being aware of the effects of migrant labor, unequal access to education, divisions between English and Afrikaans-speaking whites, and class divisions in a way that I find was rare for many people of her time. This gut reaction was strengthened and given an ideological framework when she moved to Johannesburg to study physical education, was exposed to activities of the CPSA through the Young Communist League, and became involved in selling and distributing the Guardian newspaper, joined a Marxist discussion group, and met and began interacting with her future partner, Ivan, who was also the business manager of the Guardian and who had been radicalized and joined the party during the Second World War. The book and the paper traced their growing role within the party against the development of the party into a non-racial movement, its interaction with the other arms of the Congress Alliance, the intensification of the struggle, including the adoption of the armed struggle, and increasing repression by the apartheid state. It also looks at some of the tensions within the movement at the time. In the absence of the Moscow millions, so beloved by the apartheid regime's propaganda machine, many of Ivan and Leslie's activities revolved around collecting money to fund the party and its campaigns. The Guardian was one source of funding. Somewhere between 1952 and 1954, Ivan was also involved in starting a Christmas hamper scheme called Arnold's Christmas Hampers. Clients could place orders for hampers and pay them off during the course of the year, receiving the groceries and goods at Christmas time. Included in repayments was a subscription to the newspaper. This was the further source of party funding. Ivan, Rika Hodson, Mac Maharaj, and others toured the countryside collecting funds from small-scale business people. Others, including Leslie, solicited, received, and disbursed funds from overseas funding bodies to support those facing trial for political activities and supported the families of detainees and political prisoners. Ivan was involved in the launch of Radio Liberation, the voice of the ANC underground, and worked with his old comrade and friend, Walter Sisulu, underground. Leslie was actively involved in coordinating and managing underground networks to assist comrades fleeing the regime to leave the country or to go into exile. Leslie also assisted in receiving and disseminating overseas and local clandestine material on behalf of the party. In addition to these tasks, it was her income as a personal trainer that brought the bulk of the money, which supported her, Ivan, and their two children, Peter and Jill. Ivan was finally arrested under the 90 days detention law in July 1964. He managed to smuggle a note out of prison detailing the torture he was experiencing. Leslie brought an urgent application in the Rand Supreme Court seeking an interdict against police, preventing them from further assaulting him and to bring him before the court to give evidence about his treatment. Colonel George Clint, the police chief, denied that any torture, as always they denied it, had occurred, and the application failed. Justice Snyman of the Transvaal Division of the Supreme Court ruled that no court, and I quote now, could order that a detainee be brought before it for any purpose. Interrupting detention in this way would frustrate the provision of the 90 days law, which was designed to protect the safety of the state by isolating those who sought to undermine it. This decision was subsequently upheld on appeal. I would argue that these decisions, taken together with Ogilvy Thompson's decision in Rousseau versus Sachs, may together be regarded as infamous judgments in South African legal history. They established the precedent, which continued to be used in apartheid South Africa and its Bantustans right until the collapse of the apartheid regime, that the courts would continue to refuse to act in matters concerning the conditions of and torture of detainees. This period marked a turning point in the treatment of detainees. The police were increasingly prepared to use torture on political prisoners, irrespective of race or gender. By this time, arrests and detentions had left a serious gap in the leadership structures of the SACP. In terms of a prior agreement made with Brown Fisher, Leslie and Violet Weinberg began to serve on the Central Committee of the party. As with Violet, this signified a new burst of Communist Party activity on Leslie's part. Believing that she had no alternative but to take up where Ivan had left off, she took over the running of Arnold, was a major organizer of Communist Party funds at the time, and later played a crucial role in coordinating Bram Fischer's movements and in opening fake bank accounts so that he'd be able to survive while in hiding during his Scarlet Pimpernel period, as it's known. In order to evade the attentions of the special branch, Leslie also drew in sympathetic friends like Doreen Tucker, Luli Kalinikos, and others who were not as well known to the authorities to assist Violet and herself in their underground activities. This was a crucial development which has largely been ignored in existing historiography of the party, women stepping up to the plate and assuming new roles in addition to those that they were already performing when the men were prevented from doing so. The trial of Bram Fischer and 13 others began on 16th November 1964. In January of the following year, Bram Fischer decided to forfeit bail and go underground. Proceedings resumed against the 13 other accused. Fischer was subsequently disbarred for istreating bail. He'd later be tried separately and be sentenced to life imprisonment. Judgment was delivered against Ivan and the other accused in April 1965. Ivan and Eli Weinberg were each sentenced to 5 years imprisonment. Sentences for the other accused varied between 1 and 3 years. A week after Bram's eventual capture, Leslie was detained on 18th November 1965. On 27th January of the following year, Leslie was called to give evidence against Fischer in his preliminary hearing after his rearrest. She refused to do so and was sentenced to 300 days imprisonment. This she served in solitary confinement in the Old Fort prison. Violet Weinberg refused to testify in the subsequent trial of MK operatives Izzy Heyman and Michael Dinkake. She was sentenced to 3 months. Subsequently, both she and Leslie were charged in a new Communist Party trial appearing in the Johannesburg Regional Court. They were sentenced to 2 years, and I quote, for taking part in the activities of the Communist Party. These sentences ran consecutively with the sentences Leslie and Violet were already serving. I was going to talk about the children here, but lack of time is going to prevent me from doing so. I will raise that in discussion if anybody wants me to. After the completion of her 300 days in solitary, Leslie was transferred to Barberton and began serving her second sentence. This meant an end to solitary confinement and a return to close interaction with comrades. Although it was also awful, she says it was also a relief, but conditions were extremely hard there. In addition to the restrictions imposed by the prison authorities, there were no breaks from living in constant close proximity to comrades. A number of them were extremely strong personalities, and this brought tensions, as did the fact that Leslie and some of the others had begun to rethink the nature of the struggle and their role in it by this stage. Others were just as committed to their beliefs in communism as they had always been before.
2 minutes, Alan.
Sorry, how many minutes?
2.
2 minutes, okay.
Please wrap up.
Right, okay. After her release, Leslie suffered banning orders which lasted until 1978. Banned under house arrest and carrying the stigma of being a convicted communist, Leslie found it extremely difficult to find work. She managed to carry on teaching her exercise women. They drew up a roster. Leslie saw them one at a time at their houses, charging them 3 rand a time. This kept her going. Ivan and Eli were released in April 1970. They were also subject to banning orders. After his release, a group of exiles sent money to Ivan to buy a ticket to leave the country. He returned the money and told them to stick it, quote unquote. Both he and Leslie firmly believed that activists should remain within the country. No longer able to play an active role in the underground work of the party, as he was too well known to the authorities, he concentrated instead on organizing support for and raising funds to assist those political prisoners still behind bars. This brought to a fore long-term tensions between Ivan and some leading members of the external wing of the party, which had been simmering for quite some time. Significantly, despite the fact that they had never blindly followed party line and were dismissive of what they saw as the excesses of Stalinism, both Ivan and Leslie were tactful enough in their dealings with the different factions in the party to avoid being branded as Trotskyites or counter-revolutionaries, even after their links with its external structures had become strained. Okay, Ivan subsequently died on 24th of July, 1981. Leslie has said that her life after her release from prison is a different chapter and doesn't really want me to discuss it in this paper, so I've chosen to respect this. She's retired in Johannesburg. When I found her during the prison COVID-19 pandemic last year, she was upbeat about the prolonged lockdown, telling me that it was nothing compared to detention, imprisonment, and house arrest. Okay, if I can just read my concluding paragraph. Neither Leslie nor Ivan have been remembered in the party hagiography. However, as ordinary communists, both of them played an important role behind the scenes. Both were actively responsible for raising and dispersing the funds for the underground activities of the party. Leslie played a key role in smuggling activists who had been compromised out of the country and in orchestrating Brown Fisher's movements underground. Their erasure has partly resulted from their lack of a public profile and partly from the fact that they moved away from party involvement after their release from prison. However, in Leslie's case, the fact that she was a woman has contributed even further. It was the actions of countless ordinary communists, just as much as the publicly acknowledged icons, that fueled the struggle. Ordinary people, with all of their contradictions, inconsistencies, and foibles, can, through commitment and compassion, live deeply meaningful lives, achieving great things. They can leave a name behind them. I hope that I've written a history which is a triumph of the everyday, rather than a trumpeting of the powerful and the glorious. Sorry, I hope I didn't read that too quickly, but I was worried about time, with reason, it seems. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Alan. Thanks for sticking to the time. I'm sorry, I'm dealing with technology. Okay. Billy, it's over to you. I wanted to let everybody know, especially those that are joining along the way. I've posted in the chat a link to South African History Online, to the page where you can view all the paper abstracts and biographies of the speakers. Billy's title has slightly changed from the one that's on the program. Let me read it out to you, sorry. The title is The Cost of Lives Unlived, Jenny and Marius School in London. Over to you, Billy. I know you want to share a presentation. Does it give you that option?
Yes.
Okay.
Okay. So is that there? I think that's there. Can everybody see this?
We see you.
Okay. All right. Okay. Great. So, thank you. I want to write about lives that never happened. I want to write about moments in a life, small decisions which would have, could have, should have opened up entirely different set of possibilities, but didn't. I want to write about the Schoon family and the lives they could have lived. Let's see what's going on here. Oh, there we go. So as it happened, the Schoons, which is Marius, Jeanette, and their two children, Katrin and Fritz, left Botswana in June of 1983. And within 6 months, the Schoon family made their way to Angola, with Marius and Jeanette working as English teachers at a socialist teachers college in the southern city of Lubango. So that's the university where they worked. Then just a few months later, on the 28th of June, a package arrived and tore their lives to pieces. That's the apartment building where they live. And a parcel bomb arrived, sent by the apartheid state security services, and sent debris flying down from the 4th floor of that building all across the street. And Jeanette and Katrin Schoon died that day, and Fritz survived the bombing, but was severely traumatized by it all the same. And Marius Schoon was left a widower and a single father, carrying with him the tremendous grief of losing his wife and daughter, along with a deepening of his internal rage against the brutality of apartheid. So as I say, that is what actually happened. There's Katrin Schoon is the second to the left there. When I went to Angola, one of the fathers of the other children really wanted to make sure that I could see her there. So this is a story that's all too familiar to those who spent their lives fighting against apartheid or studying such lives. I think sadly that histories of the struggle against apartheid have suffered from a lack of imagination in general and on the whole, which has led to an overemphasis on suffering and loss. And furthermore, I think that the internal dynamics of the anti-apartheid struggle tended to glorify sacrifice, taking tremendous risk, and placing oneself in harm's way. So in the Schoon's case, their years in Botswana would be described by the ANC as living in a frontline state. Therefore, when it came time for the Schoons to leave Botswana, they would have naturally felt a strong pressure for staying as close to the front line as possible, such as Angola, rather than the relatively muted impact of an exile existence in London. If you read Ronnie Casserol's paper about a different person, he describes exactly that. He describes someone who did go to London, but says they would have rather to stay in Africa. This is very common that many people I interviewed said the same. So in this context, any historical writing about the Schoons would generally tend to congratulate them for their decision to live in Angola, a free and revolutionary country that was openly supportive of the ANC, rather than emphasizing the intense danger and hardships that the Schoons encountered while living there. So, however, over these past few years of researching the Schoons, I've encountered at least 3 distinct moments where Marius and Jeanette quite seriously considered the option of moving to London or Ireland rather than staying on in Africa. So how do these moments of contemplating an entirely different life path fit within the stories that we have grown accustomed to reading and writing? Based on the available evidence, an account of the Schoons' lives in the UK would likely require a skilled novelist rather than a historian. And perhaps we'll never know whether Jenny and Marius Schoon would have preferred London or Dublin for their time in exile rather than Angola. But what we know is that this question is not merely a matter of personal preference. Embedded within this tangled series of stories are a whole slew of questions regarding the nature of politics and the range of options available to stalwarts of the anti-apartheid struggle. The story we cannot yet tell is the one in which the Schoons survived the onslaught all around them and carved out a future for themselves and for their children. We do not yet know how to imagine the possibility that the Schoons may have rathered a life of relative obscurity, assisting the anti-apartheid movement from afar from the relative safety of the British Isles. Without a genuine reckoning with the substance of the Schoons' unlived lives in London, we will not be able to understand the full extent of what was lost on the 28th of June, 1984. So in what follows, I'll present a brief summary of each of the critical moments when the Schoons contemplated leaving the front line. Each of these three stories provide openings for historians to imagine a different history, path towards a different future. All right, I need to move forward on the slides. I don't know why I'm not doing that. No. Here we go. Okay, so the first of the three moments when the Schoons contemplated leaving for London came up actually while Marius Schoon was incarcerated. He was in Pretoria Central Prison for 12 years for attempted sabotage. So other people have already mentioned getting these files from the Ministry of Justice, declassified files related to certain people. So in Marius's files, there's this from the Commissioner of Prisons. I'm just sharing this out of curiosity. Basically, I'm fascinated by what it says here, that they know that he's still a committed communist after 12 years in jail, but they're saying the possibility always exists that if he is brought under the influence of others whose ideology is more acceptable to the democratic rather than the communistic outlook, then he may swing to the right. So they were hoping that that would happen through interacting with this family. And the computer is not showing you the next slide. So his family members were, there we go. His sister, who had been raising his daughter also while he was in prison, was petitioning for him to be able to go to London after leaving, after being released from prison. And he wasn't released until September of '76, and he started asking for this in October of '75. So I have this is very thin, the information I have about this. There's nothing in there that gives Marius's view about why go to London. I don't know. I just guess things. Hugh Lewin was imprisoned at the same time for a number of years there and had gone to London. Maybe something there. But anyway, there's nothing there. But what's striking is that that was his original intent, that he would leave prison, spend a few weeks with his family, and then go straight to London. And the prison authorities were happy to let that happen. And still the slide's not moving. Okay, I have to do that. All right. So then the second moment where they thought about going to, or there was the possibility of going to England, is when they were leaving Botswana. And this is a huge section of the story that I tried to figure out, because how they ended up in Angola is really critical to understanding that assassination. What were their motivations for being there? What was their role within the ANC? Anyway, I can't go into all of it, but I've tried to write extensively about their time in Angola after making a research trip there and so forth, and interviewing as many people as I could. There's a lot of layers to that story, and there's a lot of gaps, and there's a lot of contradiction in the stories. But there was one piece that was really, really solid all through my research period, which is based on an interview that Marius Schoon did with Hilda Bernstein in the 90s. And he describes why they felt like they really had to leave Botswana. And I carried that story. I think Marius had that understanding of what happened to his death. I think everybody who I met who knew the family well had the same understanding of what had happened that pushed them out of Botswana. And so I want you to hear Marius tell that story now.
In the middle of June of '77, we got a phone call and we were called in to see the British High Commissioner.
In 1983.
And he said to us, I've been instructed by the Foreign Office to inform you that the Foreign Office has what they regard as excellent intelligence information, that you, that is me, are to be shot by the South Africans in Botswana. And I have been informed by the Foreign Office to advise you to leave immediately. And we were very skeptical. So he picked up the phone and he phoned Brigadier Hirschfeld, who was at the time the head of the special branch in Botswana. And we rode around in the ambassadorial car to police headquarters in Gaborone. Went in straight away to see Brigadier Hirschfeld. And basically, word for word, he said the same to us as the British High Commissioner had said, adding, however, that the information that he had came from a source different from that of the British.
Okay, so that's a really gripping story that he's being told, we have excellent intelligence information that you're going to be shot. And from two different sources, supposedly two different sets of intelligence. And I carried that sense that they had a real sense that their lives were in imminent danger. And then that made my understanding of their time in Angola more complicated also because, it's to go into an active war zone with two small children who are under 5 years old, when you feel like your life is in danger, it's a tremendous decision. So anyway, so then I went and did research in the British National Archives and looked at the Foreign Commonwealth Office files. And I found a really strikingly different story than the one that Marius carried with him to his death. And so this issue of there being excellent intelligence information that there's going to be attacked, I found in over a year of the files, the different telegrams and exchanges between different members of the British government, not a shred of that, not a single moment where they have anything about actual danger that might come towards the Scoons. And the only thing I did find was something that was the opposite, which was said, so it's redacted, but I believe that means it's coming from the South African security services, that their own views on press reports at the time of Scoon's departure from Botswana were that fears of a raid by the SADF with Scoon as a target were greatly exaggerated. His opinion was that Scoon was probably safe from attack. Are we already 2 minutes? Oh, wow. Okay, so I can't show you all the things. So there's a long campaign to push the Scoons out by the FCO. And I'd love to show you more evidence of that. But anyway, and it's all about protecting British citizens. It's not about protecting Marius Scoon. And there's also a long exchange that happens to not grant the Scoon family any asylum in the UK. You can see there, this in the small writing in the margin, this assumes that he belongs to the UK. Jenny had Irish citizenship. The family had contracts to work with a British NGO called the International Voluntary Service that were set to go until August of 1984 after the assassination date. They could have moved to England and continued out their contract. There's moments in these files where they seem interested in that option, but they're actively blocked by the British government. And I don't know that they that the Scoons were even aware of that. Okay, and then there's I just want to end with this. The third story is the question of third moment is even while they were in Angola, they were still planning to leave and go to Ireland and still pursuing that option of living in Ireland. So like I say, the question of whether they actively wanted to be part of that revolutionary experiment in Angola is complicated, and there's a lot of sides of it that look like that. This is a transcript from one of the students who had been at that teacher's college. He really wanted me to see that even that he was studying psychology, he's still studying dialectical and historical materialism, political economy, so forth. It was a very Marxist space that they were working in, very international space. I just want to end with one last clip from Marius. I'm sorry to go 1 minute over time, but where he describes their desire to leave, actually.
We had a flat. The lift didn't work in the flat because the Portuguese had taken some of the parts away. Water ran, well, sometimes for an hour or so a day, but basically never. So we had arranged that, we'd made arrangements already that Jenny had got an Irish passport because her grandfather had been born in Ireland. He'd gone to Australia when he was a baby in arms, but she was entitled to the Irish passport on that basis. And we had made arrangements that we were actually going to go over to Ireland in the university vacation in the middle of the year to investigate the possibility of my trying to get a passport, because she'd seen the embassy in Harare and hadn't had very much joy from them. So we'd made those arrangements. And then, as you know,
Okay, thank you. I've gone over time. Thank you so much.
Thanks very much, Billy. Sorry, but you had to end it there. It's now over to Nkosinathi Teledi. I'm trying to unpin. Let's see. Nkosinathi. I'm looking for him.
I'm here.
Here you are.
Yes, and thank you very much.
Is your video on, Nkosinathi?
It is on, yes.
Why can't I see this? Oh, here you are. I'm gonna pin it now. Okay, over to you. You have 15 minutes. Thanks very much.
And I hope to make it within that time. Well, taking a platform with such powerful and experienced panelists within the academia is quite intimidating to a student who's me. More intimidating, it's I see even my supervisor is part of the audience. So I'm double intimidated. Well, the paper I submitted, which was ultimately distributed, goes up to 90 pages. That covers my current studies on Joe Slovo's political thoughts. I've since refined it and it's down to just below 30 pages or so, and sure it can be redistributed. Now, in the commentary that I'm going to make, it's about Joe's involvement, Joe Slovo's involvement and contribution within various progressive formations for the liberation of the country as a whole, which is the Communist Party. Now, the formation of the CPSA on the 30th of July 1921, after a series of discussions between trifling left-wing groups, it's widely covered in wide-ranging literature. And since its inception, the party went through a number of phases. And the focus here is on the period that of Joe's entrance into the CPSA. And the 1930s is the period when Joe arrived in the country from Lithuania. And his upbringing and entrance into politics meandered through various formations, activities, and circumstances. So he was influenced by the Zionist youth movements, one in Lithuania before he came to South Africa, and the other one here in the country. He was influenced by John O'Meara, who was his school teacher, whom he regarded as having ingrained the first seed of political interest in him. So the Jewish immigrants as well, which he stayed with around Hillbrow in Johannesburg, and the boarding houses had a great influence on him. And that's where he attended the Jewish left book clubs and other political activities. And due to social and economic conditions, he was compelled to leave school at a very young age. He was 14 years at the time, to explore employment prospects and got employed in a pharmaceutical company of the Saif brothers. He immediately joined the National Union of Distributive Workers, National Union of Distributive Workers, an all-white trade union in a sense, though it had so-called B branches, which was for Indians and coloreds. The union could not legally have blacks within the fold at the same time, especially with the 1947 legal change. So Joe became the shop steward, learning the strength of solidarity and unity in action. He led a strike around wages and the closed shop, which resulted in his dismissal under false pretenses. He secured another employment in a different company, and he was dismissed a few months down the line after the owner realized that he was already Bolshevizing the African workers. He could understand at that stage that no section of the working class could vouch of freedom when the others remain oppressed. So upon his second sacking, he joined the South African Army to the World War II on the CPSA's mandate of fighting fascism or fighting against fascism. So upon his return from the war and as a conscious militant ex-soldier driven by the CPSA's ideological direction, he became a member of the Springbok Legion, which was a union for the ex-soldiers. Joe applied and was granted a 5-year scholarship to study law at Wits, and he immediately joined the student politics. Within the realm of the university's challenges and political consciousness of his group, they moved from the principle that universities could not somehow be divorced from the politics of the wider society. They canvassed not simply to defend the status quo, but also to extend the rights of Black students on campus and to involve the sprawling student community in a wider political struggle against the apartheid government. He participated in the CPSA's hectic radical political activities outside the university, like the food raids at Fortsburg, James Mpanza's squatter camp movement, and a lot more other activities that were taking place. The sticking out political activity that detonated and shook the system to its very foundations was the 1946 strike by African mine workers led by the communists. The state retribution to that strike was very ruthless. Leaders were arrested, compounds encircled by police, and the offices of the African Mine Workers Union were ransacked. So the protest was brutally repulsed, and 12 miners died, leading to 52 individuals, including Moses Kotane, J.P. Marx, and many other communists being arrested and prosecuted. So it became, and that was a political trial, an effort by the apartheid state to show that it was not soft on the red menace, which they saw it as a Moscow ideological agenda. So despite the failure of the strike, or to achieve its intended purpose, the strike became such a milestone in South Africa's social and political development. It had an effect on encouraging more radical and militant policies within the Black opposition movement. An ideological shift within the Indian community, which they perceived themselves as the elite, as workers, as Indians, as their own. So outraged by the government's enactment of the Asiatic Lantana Act, they launched a concerted 2-year passive resistance campaign opposing the measures. Now the change was to ensure, or was to enter, ideologically, to enter in a period of active cooperation between the oppressed, all the entire oppressed as a whole within the country. Secondly was the emergence of the ANC Youth League, which instilled a spirit of radicalism and defiance, which drastically changed the ANC's old style of making speeches, holding meetings, passing resolutions, and sending deputations. Joe was still at Wits at the time when he became a constant visitor to Colvert House on Market Street. He blended with individuals from different races and circumstances. Colvert House was the meeting place for young left activists during the 1940s. It became a sort of socio-political center and a think and talk place where the progressive forces shared ideas and planned action. So Joe was admitted at the bar immediately after completing his law degree at Wits by the beginning of 1951. He practiced for 12 years, which he regards as satisfying and politically useful at a personal level. And I'll talk a bit about the CPSA inauguration, the dissolution of the CPSA and inauguration of the SACP, which was a prime, well, the CPSA obviously was a prime target of the National Party as it assumed power in 1948. So, and the party had to re-strategize. Faced with the threat of its existence and the potential inability of its members to engage in a political and trade union activities, the CPSA acted swiftly before enactment of the act and resolved to dissolve the party on the 20th of June 1950. With the participation of Joe and a few others at Wits, the new SACP was found between 1951 and 1953. Well, I haven't found any record about the exact date of the launch, but it's between 1951 and 1953. So 6 underground conferences were convened by the party between 1952 and 1962. Elections of leadership continued to take place under the method established at the inaugural conference, and the decision about existence of the SACP was to be kept secret until the 14th of July 1960, when it was pronounced. Now, the 1962 conference developed and adopted a program called the Road to South African Freedom. From the program, the principle that guided the party or the party's efforts had been the need to build up the broadest united front of patriotic and anti-racist forces in the struggle against white domination. The concept of colonialism of a special type provided the theoretical basis for yoking together the forces of national liberation and working class revolution. In pursuance of this objective, the Freedom Charter adopted at the Congress of the People in 1955 had become the party's immediate program of National Liberation Alliance in the short term. Yes, the decision was taken obviously by the ANC to call the Congress of the People, and it became the ANC's blueprint moving forward. But almost all the elements within the Freedom Charter are from the 1962 program of the SACP. And in any way, it was an illegal organization at the time. It couldn't have called any of the meetings. Now, because of time, I'll club together the Defiance Campaign, the treason trial, the turning point into the struggle.
Just 2 minutes left, Nkosinathi. Sorry about that.
All right. All right. Out of the ANC Youth League radical program, pure program of action, which changed the ANC's political direction, it led to the Defiance Campaign. Joe and others established the South African Congress of Democrats, and he represented it on the National Consultative Committee. and then out of the Defiance campaign, Congress movement was established, and which led to the development or drafting of the adoption of the Freedom Charter in 1955. Then we had the 1956 treason trial, where Joe and 155 others were charged for treason, but acquitted later in 5 years' time. So, and the trial became such a political mobilization and international recognition of South Africa's brutal system. Then the Sharpeville massacre, which led to the banning of the ANC and the PAC and leaders, and then reached the turning point now, where the SACP first took a resolution to for the establishment of an armed wing, Mkhonto we Sizwe, followed by the ANC later. Then it was put off the ground. Madiba and Joe Slovo were the key figures in putting together the armed wing, Mkhonto we Sizwe. Joe left the country in May 6, 1963 on an external missions and stayed in London, where he completed immediately his master's degree. Then he operated obviously within the MK structures with comrades like Ronnie Casrills and others, a lot more in the camps. On a conclusion, the context or the exact content of the CPSA's officially idealistic vision did not remain the same, but changed under the influence of changing socio-political circumstances. The Comintern policy, different personalities active within the CPSA, a new analysis of the South African situation by the South African communists. Now, I'll skip the rest and say what needs to be asked is whether the ideals that Joe and the rest of those who sacrificed their lives for are outlived today, and what must be done. Without doubt, South Africa is a functional democracy. However, there are serious discourses that divide along class and racial lines, with a split between rich and poor, largely overlapping with race identity. The mass poor, or the mass of the poor majority, the unemployed, the urban and poor rural are continuously seen on mass demonstration, crying for delivery of services, simple delivery of services. The demonstration pulls expressions of struggle politics to articulate and fight for interests, or in most cases to obtain recognition as citizens with dignity.
I'm afraid we have to close. Nkosinathi, please finish.
All right. Anyway, Joe's and the rest, their ultimate aim was to construct a socialist society in South Africa, and that is not achieved as yet. And South African challenges are still mounting with the current political system. Surely that should be a real-time bomb. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Thank you, and sorry to have to be very strict with the time with everyone, but we have two more speakers, so we need to move on. Ronnie, it's over to you with your paper on Comrade Mzala.
Thank you very much. I'm delighted to be with you. We left off with the last speaker. And the challenge for the Communist Party, the ANC, the Alliance, the country, all of us. And it's very fitting to you, Arianna, Noor, and the History Workshop that you're devoting this time to the centenary of the party. You know, as we meet here, I was reading this morning a review by one Frederick Engels, written in 1857, about the ignominious retreat of the British from Afghanistan. And it reads like the situation that the gringos, the Yankee imperialists, have faced today. So anybody, and we've heard this quite often, including by some members of the Communist Party on one occasion who derided me for getting too involved in the past, in history. That history is vital if we're to understand the world today in any situation. Okay, so I've got my paper on Jabulani, nobleman Khumalo, who was known in MK as Mzala, a Portuguese term called, meaning cousin. He was very popular, but there was also a great deal of criticism about him because he never let up, and some comrades got tired of his polemics. I'll come to that at the end if I can manage to get this into the 15 minutes. So Mzala, quite recently, with the succession of the Zulu king, there was a great deal of noise out of that kingdom by one Prince Buthelezi, who began to lambaste Mzala, Jabulani Khumalo, for having libeled him in the past, way back when Mzala interviewed him in Swaziland round about 1981. The result was a book the young man wrote entitled Chief with a Double Agenda, about the said prince. Quite soon afterwards, in the mayhem that erupted in KZN, I noticed on one occasion supporters of the destabilizers who were demanding the release of one Jacob Zuma, and they were carrying a banner which had the name of Jabulani and Khumalo emblazoned on it, because that was the name of their particular region of the ANC. Mzala would be spinning in his grave at that kind of thought, and I hope to bring the reasons out very briskly. So who was he? A young man born in 1955, the year of the Congress of People and Freedom Charter, who died at the age of 35 in exile in London, where he was working with Brian Bunting as the deputy editor of the African Communist, very young age. And he came out of the rural parts of that kingdom, the far north, 200 kilometers from the Seswati, as we call it now, the Swazi border. His parents, though, were devout Christians and school teachers. And when you consider the advantage of that to a young African growing up in South Africa of the mid-1950s, going to school in the 1960s, there was a great deal of value. It gave him a very profound belief in religion, for sure, and he continued to quote from the Bible, but it was the emancipatory aspect. Moses was his hero, delivering his people from bondage, wherever that might be, the deep south of America, Latin America, the deep south of Africa. But he was and of course, he had the discipline of study through them. They sent him to various schools. He kept getting expelled because of innate radicalism. And this was before he was influenced by Black consciousness, which of course develops in the late 1969 and into the 70s, when he's pretty young. But he was already expelled from one of the schools, and expelled from a second one round about 1954. And in the first case, it was rebelling against authoritarianism, the way that they were treated by Black teachers, and of course some whites. And then the fact that the school that he went to, his secondary school near Impangeni, not far from Vryheid, where he had grown up, was very pro the KwaZulu homeland. And he, in his mind, he detested that. He was patriotic to South Africa. And what had brought this about was the Christianity, because at that stage, there was a radical theological liberation factor, and that affected him out of a young Christian movement that he was part of. And very quickly, he was into SASO, South African Students Organization, at the time that he's expelled from that pro-Buthelezi school, has to write his matric independently, gets through to the University of Zululand in Goya, and with the Soweto uprising, he is totally involved. The authorities expel him, the police are hot on his trail, and he crosses the border into independent Africa to look for Umkhonto we Sizwe, and lands up not far from where the Skuans were in Nova Katenga, near Benguela in Angola, where we had our main training camp where the likes of Jack Simons and Mark Shoppy and others were lecturing. He gets to know Paulo Jordan, who's running Radio Freedom in Luanda, and later gets quite involved with Paulo in other parts of Africa. But I come on the scene in 1977, and I can remember with the comrade Paulo and myself, we got very involved with Mzala, who had come out of training with a ferocious wound in his cheek. A gun discharged by a fellow trainee by accident had struck him here and come out his ear, and he was recuperating thanks to Cuban doctors. He loved them from then on because they saved his life. And quite soon, I involved him in the commissariat of all the camps. We had half a dozen and more camps in time throughout Angola, and he absolutely excelled. From there, we deployed him to the front line. I was by then in Mozambique in 1980, and we brought him into the political underground. Very soon we transferred him to Swaziland, highly dangerous place, and he was working with both the political and the military structures. He was quite redoubtable and creative, and to survive there, he posed as a Swazi journalist. Living across the border, he had all the appearances and the diction and so on of the Siswati. And that's how he came to interview Buthelezi, who was visiting on one occasion in that kingdom. And the interview resulted, one, in articles in the Swazi Times, but secondly, in a photograph of Mzala, and the Swazi police got onto him. So he was in dire trouble and was kicked out. But we brought him back in under a different name and disguise, and that's when I worked very closely with him. In short, Arianna, a young man who was by then a member of the Communist Party, through Angola and his reading and studies and the curricula which Oliver Tambo had agreed should involve Marxism-Leninism, he became a fervent Marxist, not agreeing with everything. He never ever accepted the Soviet Union claim that they had resolved the national question. And you can see how far off the mark they were and how close he was to realizing that. But he was absolutely taken with the idea of how we should prosecute the armed struggle, the fact that our political and our military aspects were in parallel universes. They didn't come together. It was a great hindrance. And he was constantly debating that aspect. He came up with two wonderful articles out of discussions in Maputo. And the one which was published, I think it was Sichaba, I haven't been able to find it, but it was called it was called Cooking the Rice in the Pot. And by that he meant no question of us getting anywhere from exile. We had to be in the country to get the struggle going. He was rather militaristic with that. He expected the debate. Comrades spoke volubly. Very few like him wrote. And as a result, using another pseudonym, he responded to himself, arguing against himself, and he's titled that "Preparing the Fire to Cook the Rice in the Pot," because he had come to realize the need for political preparation. He was deployed in Swaziland. In brief, he was very involved with the opening up of the first real rural-based MK guerrilla territory in Gwavuma, in the northern part of South Africa, of Zululand, just across from the Swazi border. By then, he had been deported again from Swaziland and landed up in Tanzania. It was very hot in Swaziland in terms of security. The guerrilla front got bust and people killed, and quite a number on Robben Island as a result. And we couldn't bring him back into Swaziland at all. So he ends up working to some degree. Comrade Paulo, I had a discussion with him the other day. I'm not sure whether he's with us today, but he said to me that Mzala never really was involved in Radio Freedom or in Comrade Paulo's work of publicity, etc. But to some degree, what happens to the young man next is he studied at the Lenin School, he studied in the GDR. The Communist Party see in him a rising star, and he's sent to Prague to work on Marxism Today. The most prestigious, some would argue against that, Marxist-Leninist publication of the communist movement in Prague. He is ill. Quite frankly, it's not spoken about. He's detected with HIV and AIDS. And I'll tell you something, this wasn't a guy who was rushing around and indiscreet. I believe he picked it up through the blood transfusions. Have I got 2 minutes now, Arianna? 2. Through the blood transfusions that he underwent in Angola. So he ends up there, he goes to London, and he works with Brian Bunting on the African Communist. Just to end by saying that between basically 1982, 83 to 1990, he couldn't write any longer after 1990, 91. He dies in 1991. I have gone through the African Communist. This young man had 5 nom de plumes that I know of, and I could trace this down to 16 articles, reviews, and the like in the African Communist. That's 16 in less than 10 years. I want to end by saying that even the most prolific writers in the African Communist, Joe Slovo over 30 years comes nowhere near that. Ronnie Caswell's over 20, 25 years doesn't come near it. The only ones who are that prolific tend to be the editors like Larumo, Mike Harmel, like Brown Bunting. And there you have the reason why when he dies, there is such praise from the Communist Party, who says, this was our rising star. This country needs 1,000 Mzalas, and we are bereft at this enormous loss, both for the ANC and, of course, the Communist Party. If I can quickly say why my article is called "The Peripatetic," the portrait of a peripatetic communist, is, of course, people here will know peripatetic refers to a person who walks around a lot and travels. He traveled through 9 different countries. The mobility studies model of biography and autobiography places great focus on that factor, not just the influence on a human being of that kind of travel, but the fact that you went through, metaphorically, you go through a huge change in terms of your ideology, etc. And that Mzala, the young rural boy out of the the sticks of KwaZulu-Natal, born in a religious situation. It had an impact, an impression on him throughout his life. He gets into the liberation movement, into Marxism and the Communist Party, and there's an enormous transformation in his worldview, in his ideology. And of course, the Communist Party is rightly proud, as our country should be, of this young man, Jabulani, nobleman, noble indeed, and his contribution. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ronnie. Thanks for sticking to the time. It's now over to Terry Barnes, who's gonna provide some initial comments on the papers, and I'll then open it up to the audience. Can I remind you to please put your comments directly in the collective chat, or if you'd like to speak, to message me privately, and then I'll call out your names. It's better that way so I can keep track of the order. Over to you, Terry. Thanks a lot.
Great. Arianna, can you hear me? Am I loud enough?
We can hear you. Just
Okay.
about, it's a bit faint, but we
Okay,
can hear you.
I'll speak up. Thank you.
Okay, thanks.
Thanks, Arianna. I'm really pleased. I'm so pleased and honored to be here. I like everyone, I have 15 minutes and I can't do justice to the richness and the many issues brought up by these 5 papers, but I'll try to hit on a few and trust that the audience will continue the conversations. From the land of Yankee imperialism, greetings to all the authors, to everyone in the audience, many old friends and colleagues that I haven't seen in such a long time. The fire at the UCT library underscores the urgency in doing this work of writing biography and working on the history of the Communist Party. Of course, we all hope that the special collections will be salvageable, like the papers of Ray Alexander. For example, I see one of her daughters on the call today, so all hail to the UCT librarians and their many volunteers. In 2010, there was a classic academic debate in the pages of the South African Sociological Journal between Siraj Rasool and Jonathan Hislop about political biography in South Africa. I bring this up because Ronnie Casrill's paper mentions Rasool's arguments. Rasool and Hislop agreed that many South African political biographies have tended towards what Hislop called, in quotation marks, sycophantic hackery, in supporting a narrative of the moral superiority, inevitable triumph, and eternal righteousness of the ANC and its allies. Rasool worried about the increasing production of individualist, linear, orderly, and narrow narratives which privileged organizational politics, silenced the messy contradictions of daily life, and thus merely served to support the hackery. He then wondered about the legitimacy of the entire conventional political biographical enterprise. Hislop, on the other hand, worried about the production of dull, pious, and predictable biographies, but he still found a great deal of value and promise in well-written and thoroughly researched studies. Ronnie Casrill's paper is most explicit about its motivation to provide an example of one important but previously unexamined life of service in the cause of national liberation, so that it might inspire current youth and leaders and lure them away from selfish, materialistically corrupted practices. Casrill's is most explicit about this reason for writing, but I suspect that the other authors would share it to varying extents. So in reading these papers, I ask, what kind of narratives about South African heroes are required to achieve this noble objective in the context of the hot mess into which the South African Liberation Project has devolved? The subjects of these papers, Jabulani Khumalo, known as Mzala, Joe Slovo, Leslie Schirmbrucker, Dawood Seedat, and Marius Kuhn, were each undeniably a stalwart of the struggle, who repeatedly risked life and limb and the well-being of their loved ones, comrades, and friends in contributing to the unique positionality of the SACP. And how should these lives now be told? Our 5 authors do not have identical strategies in answering this question. I would say that there are 3 reclamation projects, 1 review project, and 1 reinterpretation project. Of the reclamation projects, that's Mzala, Seedat, and Schirmbrucker. Mzala's name is fairly well known, but the details of his life and the range of his exploits are not. The firebrand Dawood Seedat seems to have been completely forgotten. Leslie Schirmbrucker, wife, mother, brave, and inventive underground schemer, has been pushed into the waste bin of masculinist history. The review project, I would summarize as Joe Slovo was present and influential at so many turning points in the struggle that his role should be reviewed. And 1 reinterpretation project, Dr. Keniston is reinterpreting the ever-shifting balance between agency and foot soldiery in the life of Marius Schoon. I'm happy to report that none of these papers falls into the category of sycophantic hackery, but each one is centrally grappling with the problem of heroism, and I think they do tend to differing degrees to gloss over Siraj's calls to illuminate the messy contradictions of daily life. Alan Kirkcaldy's portrait of Leslie Schirmbrucker falls at the messiest end of this spectrum, but he has an archive of her letters, interviews, and an unpublished memoir to draw upon. Keniston's paper clearly shows us how storied episodes of Marius Schoon's political and personal life were lived under circumstances not of his own making or even his own knowing, which is quite appropriate in a way for a communist. Nkosinati Teledi's portrait of Slovo is arguably the closest to the clean and tidy end. Goolam Vahed discusses Seedat's diverse organizational affiliations in Durban and the consequences of the steadfast activism of his wife Fatima, all of which relate to the difficult messinesses of lives devoted to politics. I would urge our authors to persist in their work and to think and write about where, when, and how factors like doubt, uncertainty, inflexibility, carelessness, stubbornness, hubris, and indecision influenced the course of their subjects' lives. As a historian, I worry about portraits of heroes in which there are no doubts, hesitations, second thoughts, or perceived challenges in discerning good from evil. If the next generation of people who are unsatisfied with the status quo are taught that in order to effect change you must be perfectly single-minded, undeterred, immovable, without doubts or qualms, what does that do? In such a formulation, anyone else, the hesitant, the cautious, the doubtful, the mistake-prone, a nail-chewer, is unworthy. Mightn't this tend to reinforce the terrible and toxic logics of exclusion? I'll be briefly heretical. Perhaps the bold and insightful Seedat has been forgotten because he worshipped at the altar of Stalinism too long. Perhaps the ebullient and energetic Mzala, who died of AIDS, was not immune to the tidal waves of sexual adventurism that surged through the long, lonely years of struggle. Perhaps Leslie Schirmbrucker, who, like Winnie Mandela, experienced the agony of watching a view of her effectively, forcibly orphaned children recede from the back window of a police van. Perhaps her disdain for people who took exit permits was overblown. Regarding Marius Schoon, how much do we need to know? And finally, perhaps Red Sox Slovo made strategic and or tactical miscalculations in a 60-year political and military career. Asking such questions does not trash or diminish the stature of these people, I think. Rather, it puts movement into the ways their lights shine. Finally, I would also ask each author, do you think your subject was able to live up to his or her vision of communism in their own life and practices? So, thank you all very much.
Thanks very much, Terry, for your comments and your provocations to the speakers. Let me see. I'm just going to do. Okay, I just want to bring all the. I think all the speakers can have their videos on if they want. We are now going to open it up to the audience and the rest of the participants. Or would you prefer to have a round of comments to respond to Terry? I see, wait a second, Ronnie, I see your hand. I'm trying to figure out something. Add pin. I'm gonna add pin, okay. And I can't, here's Nkosinati. Okay, sorry, I just wanted to bring everyone on the screen so that everyone can see you. I think while we wait for comments and questions from the participants, perhaps we can have a round of quick responses to Terry, and we can go in the inverted order from the presentation. So let's start with Ronnie and move backwards.
Oops.
Ronnie, we can't hear you very well.
Okay.
Okay,
you can now, you see, this is the thing. I mentioned that Marxism Today was in Prague. I made an error. That's the World Marxist Review, which was the international communist movement's paper based in Prague. Marxism Today was in Britain. So it's World Marxist Review that Mzala went to represent the party at. Issa Pahad had been there before him. Michael Hamel had been there in an earlier period. Just to say to Teresa, I really enjoyed her summing up. And I just want to quickly refer to an aspect of it too, and that's the Rasool and Hislop debate and their views on hagiography and this question of extolling members of a movement by those who belong to it, whether it's the Soviets or the Chinese or the Cuban or the ANC or the South African Communist Party. I think there definitely is an element to that. When you deal with a figure, just to gloss over any weakness is a problem. One needs to peel the onion and get a little bit under the skin. But, you know, if you're limited in space, if you're not writing a 300-400 page tome, if it's a centenary, if you've got 15 minutes like I've had, I thought about whether to include the fact of Mzala. People hardly mention this, that he was ill with HIV and AIDS. And I thought, no, bring that in. I thought of bringing in, which I did, the fact that there were comrades, and I've interviewed a number for my paper, who are very positive about him, but say the problem is it was all black and white, not in the color sense. He was too abrasive. He went on. One comrade said to me, the problem with Mzala when he got going and you needed to break away to go to the toilet, he came to you on your way to the toilet and stood with you when you went into the toilet to finish the point he was making. But you see, with Rasool, he takes umbrage with the fact that, first of all, we deal with human beings in a linear way. We're not creating some abstract movie where you start with a subconscious and so on. And if you start dramatically at a certain turning point, you have to go back to the origin and dig into the person's background. And what better way than to use the linear method? Otherwise, can people really follow you? And yes, the point that I argue, and in the paper, of course, in the centenary or at any kind, and when a comrade dies, yes, it is an inclination to only talk well of them and never bad. That's death. But to bring to those who are alive, to those who are facing challenges today of the kind that Teresa refers to. What do we do? And what would Mzala and the Schoenbroekers and Bram Fischer and Joe Slovo and so on say about the condition in South Africa today? And we have to bring that out and try and consider it. But to bring to the younger generation the fact that people sacrificed, they gave their lives, they suffered in order to bring about the change. So thanks for your comments, Teresa.
Thanks, Running. Kosinati, over to you.
Thanks, Arianna. I don't think there's much to comment about. Well, there wasn't a specific question anyway to me, but I must appreciate the observation and the analysis made by Teresa. And I think Comrade Tuloni made a mouthful in that regard. So I'm okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Billy?
Yeah, okay. So there was a quote from the prison wardens that I didn't include that I wanted to share now in response to this, because they say, Schoon has not deviated 1 inch from his political stance. I would reckon he is now even more hardened in the political sense than 12 years ago. He is the type who does not accept no as an answer. He is backbiting, cunning, and always suspicious. Anyway, so the reason I want to say that is because I think that my understanding of what the task is, if we took any perspective or analysis of these individuals and said, okay, that's who Marius Schoon was, like the prison warden says, that's who he is. He's someone who never accepts no. He's completely hardened in his positions. Then we could write the whole history as if that must be the answer in all cases. That must have been what he was doing. And if everyone I had interviewed said exactly the same, and there was 100% consensus, maybe that's the way that it needs to be written. But what I'm trying to say in my approach is to say that there's actually contradictory. I'm not trying to say one way or the other, but I think there are contradictory possibilities that are happening at once. That maybe they really, really wanted to go to Angola, and maybe they really dreaded it. There's a moment where Mario says, I deeply regret being sent there with my children. There's other ways that he maybe loved it. But how do we hold all of that at once?
Thank you. Alan.
Hi, Teresa. I've already commented about how cool your comments were. Thanks very much. They were great. I really strongly, if you don't mind, I'm going to adopt your term about dumping Leslie in the masculinist dustbin of history. It describes what's been done to her perfectly. It struck me particularly when I was, putting together this paper, that the way some of her comrades wrote about her was they just completely dismissed her as an appendage of Ivan's. And she was far from an appendage of Ivan's. They were completely equal partners, both on a personal level and on a political level as well. And thanks, yeah, I'll definitely take your comments into consideration. And if you don't mind, adopt your term as well.
Thanks for that. I accept the comments, and I think this relationship with Stalinism is something that needs further investigation, especially in the 1950s and 60s, and that's a good point that Teresa made, and it's something that I think I will follow on. Thanks. And I'm just wondering if at some point we can have a copy of Teresa's comments, because they were extremely useful as well.
Yes, I will make sure that we do that, and also I hope that we will be able to publish some of your papers from this webinar and some of the other webinars. So we'll be in contact with all the participants about publication plans. I see there's a comment. I don't know if Ronnie's picked it up from the chat. I also wanted to ask a question to everyone. I mean, around women and gender. In the first webinar we had, Bob Edgar spoke about his work on Josie Mpama, and women communists were the subjects of some of the papers today, or you know, were part of your papers. I just wanted to ask a sort of general question around, obviously, it's important to retrieve the role that women played within the Communist Party, but I was wondering if you had any comments on how joining the Communist Party changed, through joining the Communist Party, women shaped and changed sort of gender roles. Ronnie, did you pick up the comment from Natasha Erlang, or would you like me to read it out to you?
Is that the one about her claiming that Alex Mashinini?
Yes, that's right.
No, Alex was, that was one of Mzala's several nom de plumes. That's Mzala, Natasha. That's not somebody else. He invented, he loved different identities. He came up with that particular nom de plume. I think there is an Alex Mashinini in South Africa, but it's not him. That's Mzala, I can assure you.
Thanks, Ronnie. And the comment is actually from Mandla Radebe, not Natasha Erlang, but it does show as Natasha on the screen. Yes.
Yes, yes.
Thanks very much. I don't know if you wanted to comment on the question of gender and the Communist Party.
Can I just say something in relation to Stephanie Sachs telling everybody that Joe Slovo first wrote African Communist at the age of 40. When comrades used to be critical about Mzala going on and on and on, not in front of his face, but to Joe, who liked him, Joe's response was, whatever you say about him, and yes, he might have his problems in that regard, he writes and you guys don't. That's the big difference. And that's why we can really dissect his thoughts to this day. He leaves that legacy. And too many people just rely on silver tongues and speaking on and on, maybe like I do sometimes, but laziness of writing. And that's why you go back to Mzala's background and his parents and family who gave him that discipline, that search for the truth. They're very important. Sorry, thank you.
Can I come in on the gender issue, or?
Please go ahead, Alan, and then I think Billy has his hand up after.
Definitely joining the Communist Party gave Leslie a confidence. You know, she came from this kind of small rural village background, and it definitely gave her a confidence that she didn't have or wouldn't have had otherwise. But what really interests me was she actually, I think she was kind of concerned with fashion. I mean, she was one of the first people to kind of run around in a mini skirt in the struggle and so on. She had a very keen sense of fashion, and fashion meant a lot to her. I think she used that as a kind of camouflage. I think she had obviously a genuine interest in it. You know, she wanted to kind of use her femininity, but I also think she used it as a camouflage. There's wonderful descriptions of her, you know, going to John Orr's and kind of sitting in the tea room there, looking at the latest outfits. Meanwhile, she was meeting people at the table to plan moving Bram Fischer underground. So there was definitely kind of fashion and you know, conventions of womanhood as a camouflage for a far deeper level of involvement and activity.
Go ahead, Billy.
Yeah, okay, so I didn't try to write it. It's one of the ways I've thought about this paper that I was trying to work on, though, would have been to try to write about this, what I would call a macho tendency in the writing of in the way that the struggle is represented. So I think this emphasis on sacrifice and loss and taking tremendous risk, there's something quite macho about that. And then there's and so it means that we lack the words somehow to describe these other layers of political participation. And I think so, like there's all these moments in looking at the stories of Jenny and Marius Schoon where Jenny disappears, or so like they were co-directors of the International Voluntary Service in Botswana. But when I interview the man who hires them, he remembers that Jenny was present all the time and doing things at meetings, but doesn't remember that he hired them as co-directors. And those Foreign and Commonwealth Office papers, they only in one time in dozens of writings ever really mention Jenny or anyone else other than Marius. And I think part of that is that there's this kind of macho idea about what politics is. Marius shows up as the real political activist. He's for sure throughout their like you know, he's a real hardcore committed member of the Communist Party and the ANC. They know that for sure. But for example, Alan Fine is acquitted entirely for the charges he's facing by just claiming that when he went to visit Botswana, he only interacted with Jenny and not with Marius. And so they make this kind of distinction that the kind of political work that Jenny was doing was not as dangerous or not as threatening as what Marius is doing. And that's what I'm trying to push. I think that's quite dangerous. I think there's a whole series of different ways that people participated in politics that are getting obscured by focusing on fighting and violence and death.
Thanks, Billy. Goolam, would you like to say anything about Fatima Seedat?
No, except that, you know, for the role that she played, which is sort of features nowhere. You know, if you look at the photographs of that period, she's pictured in meetings with the people like Fatima Mir with the women's group in 1976. You know, she features quite prominently, but in the post-apartheid period, she's not to be seen anywhere. And you know, I know some of us are quite skeptical about this road name, but for the families that are involved, it really matters a lot. And they've really been trying for the last 20 years, but there's no recognition of either her or Dawood Seedat, both of them. It's quite interesting, you know, the way it works, because from the 8 years that, but this is how Azad Seedat put it to me. But so he actually then, you know, grew up as an atheist, but then he became a Shia Muslim. And because of the Iranian Revolution and the activism appealed to him. So he's actually running a mosque here in Durban, and that was bombed. I don't know if any of you recall, a couple of years ago. So he's Dawood Seedat's son is actually the person that's in charge of that mosque, but he's also a member of the Communist Party in Durban. So it's just quite interesting. But despite that, they haven't had any success. And she especially, I could not understand why you would want to name the annual lecture in Durban, the Rahima Musa lecture, when you had Fatima Seedat. So it just shows the influence of people who are well connected. Thanks.
Thanks very much. I see Mandela Radebe has now managed to divorce his identity from that of Natasha Erlang. And he wanted to come back in on the issue of Alex Mashinini and Mzala's HIV report. Mandela, would you like to unmute yourself? You can put your video on as well if you wish.
Thank you very much. I think my picture will do. I hope you can hear me loud and clear. And apologies to Natasha. I do not know how I became Natasha this afternoon. The debate around Alex Mashinini, his name is Tsidiso Mkhwanatsi, who actually wrote quite a few articles, but I think I will take that up later. I would convert Ronnie out of this platform, but I think that is a serious debate that we need to have, because there is this tendency of, and I think it's a mistake that is repeated across, that this article, Preparing the Fire Before Cooking the Rice, was written by Mzala. Of course, I was not there, so I'm just relying on the people that I'm speaking to. But I wanted to ask Comrade Ronnie on the statement is made about Mzala having had HIV. I wanted to know if either himself or the leadership of the SACP did receive medical reports that confirms this, because sometimes we make these allegations and sometimes when we try to we go deeper to them, it is difficult to prove. So I'm just curious to know if this was indeed proven, but thank you very much for a very exciting session.
Sure.
Thanks.
Rani, before you come in, I had a question related to this that I wanted to ask. I wanted to know whether at the time of his death, the cause of the death was actually made public, and if not, if you could talk about that context and why at the time it was decided not to make it public.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so let's see, am I unmuted? Yeah. Well, just to put out this question of the Mashinini authorship, I was with Mzala. We worked together for 7 years in Maputo and in Swaziland. I know, I can assure you all that Mzala wrote against himself in support to a certain degree. Put the two articles together and you can see the identical nature, if you don't believe me, as a witness to those days. And everybody knew it was Mzala using the name Alex Mashinini. I want to assure you of that. I wouldn't put something in a paper that I'm not sure of, which brings us to HIV/AIDS thing. You see, people don't want to accept it as though it's a slur. It's like people don't want to admit they've had COVID-19, especially in the early days here. Arthur Ashe disclosed that he died of HIV, etc., because of blood transfusion. And there's no way that now, in producing such an important paper for the workshop, and it's the first time I've ever gone public, because it's been kept an absolute secret. You get all sorts of papers and speeches about Mzala, who died in London, and there's no explanation. He just died. And I really seriously considered, my first versions did not reveal that. And I looked back and I thought, this is stupid. It's not a negative aspect. Why should it be? This question of dying, of contracting in whatever way HIV and AIDS. And what I wanted to make sure, because people talk about this, people gossip about it, which is why I revealed it and make the point in the paper and quote comrades, not about the illness, but who say that he was not a womanizer. I never saw Mzala in 7 years in Africa with a girlfriend. He meets his wife and Paul, and they get married and they have 2 wonderful kids. And she's alive today and very healthy. So there are people who say, well, he couldn't have had HIV and AIDS, but talk to any medical person and they'll tell you it's possible. You can have relations with a person and not come away with HIV and AIDS. It's possible. But I want to say, I can't tell you that I saw a document because I wasn't in London. I was away in Africa and I heard about it, but I've spoken to people from that time right through to recently. So I don't see why people should shy away from it or think that it's some kind of a problem that shouldn't be referred to. He was not a womanizer. There's no way that he picked it up in any other way, I believe, than through the blood transfusions. And that's what I was told, his view of speaking to comrades, saying, you know, I think I got this through the blood transfusions after the shooting incident in Luanda, in Angola.
Thanks, Ronnie. Judy Seidman would like to comment on the HIV issue. Judy, please unmute yourself, and if you want to put on your video, you can do that too.
Sorry, I think I'm unmuted now. I just wanted to add to that. At the time in the late 80s and early 90s, and now I'm speaking from my own personal experience, there was a lot of strong feeling within the ANC that we must not mention who was positive and who was not positive, who died of AIDS and so forth. There were efforts by the state, by the apartheid state during the transition, to say that they would not allow people who were positive to come back and that that might exclude many people who were in exile. And therefore there was an absolute silence about it. As I said, I'm talking from experience on this. I know that. The other thing, Ronnie, I just wanted to ask, there were at least 4 comrades who were in Swaziland in the mid 80s, from 83 to 86, who were part of that group who were HIV positive. And many of them thought they were given, that was from blood transfusions, and that that might have been one of the ways that they tried to deal with people in Swaziland. I don't know if Mzala was there during that period, but if he was, that could be an explanation as well.
Do you want me to make a response?
Please go ahead, Ronnie, and then after that, I just wanted to give everyone a chance to make final comments. So these are your final comments as well, okay. Ronnie.
Yeah. Well, you know, I hate us just getting involved in this particular element, although not disrespectful of Judy, because I have thought at times that perhaps some of our people were infected in this kind of way. And in fact, a year or so before Mzala died in London of HIV and AIDS, his closest friend was in hospital as well, and died of the consequences of being positive. I happen to know that Mzala was sent away by the Czech authorities because those countries, you know, if you were white and you came to those countries, you weren't tested. If you were black and from Africa, they tested you. I mean, it's disgusting, but that's the case. And Mzala was sent away from Prague for that reason. But good God, what's the bloody problem? You know, people pick up AIDS, they pick up COVID. It can come through blood transfusion. It can come through one involvement with a woman you love, and vice versa. What the flaming hell is wrong with that? We shouldn't treat it as though it's some kind of dreadful social misbehavior at all.
Ronnie, I'm openly living with HIV and have been since I was diagnosed in 1990. In fact, that was my personal experience on this. Yeah, so I agree with everything you're saying. I have no disagreements whatsoever.
No, I realize that. And I've got a cousin who's lived for something like 30 years. And every time that I meet him, because he's on my antiretrovirals, I hug him, I kiss him, and so on. And I did this back in the 90s when I came home, and he told me about this, and I immediately hugged him. I think it's terrible the way that people are regarded if they have something of this nature. And I'll kiss you when I meet you, Judy.
Thanks, Ronnie. There's a comment from Bob Edgar in the chat on Zala, but I'll leave you to read it. I just want to give everybody else a chance to make some final comments, including Terry. Let's go with Billy, Goolam, Nkosinathi, Alan, and then Terry.
Oh, thank you, but I don't think I have anything more to add now. Thanks so much.
Thanks. Goolam, do you have any final comments?
Yeah, no, like Billy, I also don't have anything further. I just want to thank everybody for the really stimulating discussion. Thank you.
Thank you. Nkosinathi.
Thank you very much, everybody. I think this was quite an empowering session, and one had it's a learning curve as well from one, and I think I'll get more information already. The source is now wide open. Thank you very much, everybody. Thank you.
Thanks, Nkosinathi. Let me ask you I wanted to ask you a quick question about the sources you've been using for your PhD and whether you've been able to do any interviews.
Yes, that's what in fact it's an ongoing process now, and some of the panelists here which I'm going to interview.
Okay, good luck with finishing your PhD.
Thank you very much.
Can I come in?
Please, Alan.
Yeah. Okay. I'd also like just to thank everybody, and my former students will tell you that I'm famed for anecdotes. I'd like to finish with one very brief anecdote, which is just on the gender issue again. And I won't out the person because he's still alive and I won't embarrass him. But when exiles were returning in the transition period, we had a comrade who came back from Tanzania with his partner and was seriously miffed that at the airport they were quite prepared to let him back, but gave hassles to his partner, saying she was too dangerous to let back into the country. And that seriously miffed him. So yeah, gender was a very real issue.
Thank you. Terry, are you still with us?
Yes, I'm still here. For some reason, I seem to have the last word, which after these 5 great papers, I don't think I deserve. So I'll just thank the History Workshop and everybody involved, and hope that people, like I said in my comments, that people really do keep writing and persist in grappling with these problems, because it's really important. Nobody answered my question about whether people lived up to what their own ideals of communism were in their own lives, but I'm sure that that's the sort of thing that will get folded into your larger projects. So thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you, Terry, and thanks for your really wonderful comments. I see there's a comment for Nkosinathi from Stephanie Kemp, who says, I'd love someone to examine Joe Slovo's very pragmatic, as befits activist communists, move from his strong support for path to power to entering negotiations that he always strongly rejected. Hopefully that's going to be part of your thesis as well. I just want to to thank all the speakers and all the participants today. Thanks for the great papers. As I said, we hope to publish some of the papers that are featuring in these webinars. And we will be in touch with all the speakers. I wanted to let you know that the next webinar in the series is going to be on the 15th of September on the topic of socialism, culture and networks. It's going to pick up on some of the themes that were discussed today. Judy is one of the speakers on that panel with Stephen Sack, Tom Lodge, Paul Landau, and Elizabeth Fisser, as well as a number of discussants, including Ari Sitas, Philip Menon, Percy Mabandu, and I think Corinne Sandwith. The event is going to be organized and hosted by South African History Online. The details are going to be on SAHO's page, and we'll also advertise it through usual mailing lists and networks. Thanks again, everyone, for the great papers. I think everybody really enjoyed this session, and thanks for taking part.
Can I quickly say thanks to you and Lawrence for all your work as well. Thank you very much. We appreciate it. Yes.
Thank you. Thanks, Lawrence. Lawrence has been working behind the scenes, assisting with the organizing.
Thank you, Arianna.
Thanks,
Gracias.
everybody.
Gracias.
Bye-bye, and keep in touch, everyone.
Thank you.
Stay well. See you.
Bye.